Thank you, Tess, for this brilliant expose on Mapplethorpe's collection at the Guggenheim. Fantastic. The last speaker of this session will be Bryanna Knotts, who is the assistant conservator at the Center for Creative Photography at the University of Arizona in Tucson. And Cynthia Yu is also a co-author and will be speaking as well. Bryanna will be presenting her work where she looked at the affinities between the photographs of Lola Álvarez Bravo, Tina Modotti, and Edward Weston at the CCP collection.
Hi, everyone. This research, made possible with generous funding from the Sherman Fairchild Foundation and in collaboration with the Lens Media Lab, presented the opportunity to conduct an in-depth print characterization study of photographers whose archives are housed at the Center for Creative Photography. The CCP itself is a unique collection in that we acquire entire archives alongside individual prints. Currently, the CCP has nearly 300 archival collections comprised of millions of objects and over 100,000 fine art prints. This has resulted in a vertically deep collection of photographs representing thousands of artists and archival materials to support additional research. Color, gloss, texture, and thickness measurements were taken at the CCP, and that data was collated and interpreted by our colleagues and collaborators at the Lens Media Lab. While the prints were compared amongst themselves, the data measurements were also compared to the LML's reference collection of gelatin silver papers, which is comprised of roughly 7,500 sample papers dating from the 1890s to the present day. Using this existing collection and backdrop of data points, we can more easily interpret the expressive qualities of a photograph and contextualize the CCP's collection within this space. When considering which artists to focus on, we first and foremost thought of Edward Weston, one of the cornerstone photographers whose archive is housed at the CCP. However, in conversation with Chief Curator Rebecca Senf, this quickly evolved into a research project that encompassed the larger quote-unquote sphere of Edward Weston. And we came up with the satellite of artists who were connected by this shared influence in terms of their photographic practices. Ultimately, the main idea of this research project was to track material trends shared between photographers that were known to have worked together or influenced each other at certain points throughout their careers. Through print characterization, we are gleaning whether an artist changed their preferred materials or altered their working practices based on who they met over time. We wanted to start with a pilot project, ideally a photographer with a healthy but manageable number of prints in the collection, to get our bearings before moving on to such an enormous collection like Weston's. And in the end, we decided to focus on Lola Álvarez Bravo for the pilot project because her archive was a very manageable size compared to the other two collections we were considering. And after completing analysis of the Álvarez Bravo archive, we shifted focus to Tina Modotti and Edward Weston. While we don't hold Modotti's archive at the CCP, this analysis was done in part to support a Google Artists and Machine Intelligence Research Award received by the Lens Media Lab to study Modotti and Álvarez Bravo's works. Studying her prints also served as a natural segue into Weston, since Álvarez Bravo was connected to and influenced by both photographers during her early career. Lola Álvarez Bravo began experimenting with photography in the mid-1920s following her marriage to Manuel Álvarez Bravo. Manuel taught her how to use a camera, develop film, and over time she cultivated her own unique aesthetic and appreciation for the photographic medium. Álvarez Bravo spent her entire professional career as a photographer in Mexico City, where she met many influential figures during her time there, including Frida Kahlo, Tina Modotti, who sold Álvarez Bravo her first camera, and Paul Strand, whose documentary style of photography she greatly appreciated. Álvarez Bravo quickly established herself as a respected photojournalist in post-revolutionary Mexico, as well as one of the country's earliest female photographers. She traveled extensively throughout Mexico, documenting the region's shifting landscapes, diverse peoples, and everyday life during such a transformative era. Through her photography, Álvarez Bravo carved out her niche as a documentarian of the lives of women, children, and indigenous peoples in Mexico. In her exploration of her country, she developed a viewpoint and photographic aesthetic that was completely her own and distinct from the photographers who inspired her love for the medium and influenced her early career. Modotti and Weston moved to Mexico City together in 1923 and were known to work together on various projects using the same camera equipment and capturing the same places and moments during their shared time together. To limit the scope of the Weston archive, we initially limited our focus to prints produced solely between 1920 and 1929, which includes the years he lived and worked in Mexico with Modotti and Modotti's subsequent overlap with Álvarez Bravo. For consistency reasons, only 33 of the 171 Álvarez Bravo prints we analyzed are included in the comparison we'll present, alongside 79 Modotti prints and 68 of the almost 800 Weston prints produced throughout the 1920s.
Thank you so much, Bryanna. So I'm going to jump into some of our general findings after we looked more deeply into the data from all of the measurements that were made. And I'll talk about how some of these findings have given us some greater insights into the influences across their artistic practices. So to start, what we're looking at here is the entirety of the print collections that were measured for these three artists, with the paper choices ordered by expressiveness. So the pink corresponds to Modotti, the greenish yellow corresponds to Weston, and the blue corresponds to Álvarez Bravo. So just by looking at the prints and the glyphs sorted in this order, we can already start to see how, for example, a lot of these pink glyphs for Modotti are really populating this kind of top section with the less expressive papers, while the glyphs for Weston in yellow seem to be more towards the bottom here with these more expressive papers. And then Álvarez Bravo kind of is interspersed throughout. So we can already kind of see the ways that their paper choices are generally differentiating. To illustrate this more broadly, we can look directly at the distributions of the expressiveness for these three artists. So the main takeaways here are really to focus in on the peaks here. So we can see, for example, once again, Modotti in pink here is peaking more to the left with these less expressive papers compared to Weston on the right here in yellow. And then Álvarez Bravo sits somewhere in the middle, but she has this much wider range. Now, to break this down, we can look at the histograms that make up these distributions. So I'm going to start at the left in blue with Álvarez Bravo, and here you can really see how her work is just more uniformly and evenly distributed across this wide range of paper expressiveness choices. But for Modotti and Weston to the right here, you can see these more distinct peaks that are forming. And the distinct peaks here make sense in that, like with Weston's more expressive paper choices, some of the prints that were measured for Weston in this study included some of his earlier, more pictorialist prints, so that could account for some of that greater expressiveness choices here. And then for Modotti, a lot of the papers that were selected for measurement for this study happened to include prints that she was making for various commissions that would be used for publication or further reproduction or dissemination down the line. So it makes sense she might have used a more utilitarian and economical paper here. In addition to looking at kind of overall expressiveness, we can also break down kind of the paper choices by the individual paper characteristics that were measured. So color, gloss, texture, and thickness, as seen in this set of violin plots. The violin plots essentially show kind of the general aesthetic range within which each of these artists were working. So if we start with color in this upper left, you can see how, for example, Álvarez Bravo's works really concentrate in these kind of lower, cooler toned papers. Weston here, you can see, has a larger range from kind of cool papers to warm papers. Moving to gloss in the upper right, you can see for gloss, Álvarez Bravo has quite a large variety here, from kind of more matte papers to glossier papers. But for Modotti and Weston, it's interesting that you can see they have more of this kind of bimodal approach to gloss, where you can see they have a set of papers that are more matte as well as a set that's more glossy here. And then on the bottom left, we can look at texture, and you can see that here, Álvarez Bravo and Modotti kind of are using smoother papers, while Weston has a few more rough papers here. And then lastly, in the bottom right, for thickness, you can see that thickness also kind of has this bimodal characteristic, which really corresponds to single weight and double weight papers. And here you can see how Modotti really is choosing a lot of these single weight papers. So now that we have a general sense of these artists' collections in terms of both kind of overall expressiveness as well as their individual paper characteristics, I'm going to discuss another way that we approached kind of exploring the influences across artistic practices, which was by clustering the prints based on material similarity. And the results from clustering really reinforced this notion that these artists were working in very materially distinct spaces. So these are the clusters that formed, and just to preface, I recognize that the icons on the screen are fairly small, but we're going to look more closely at some of these in just a moment. What I really want to get across is this sort of bird's eye view, so you can see how the prints are separating out in terms of material similarity. Now, what we see from the clusters is that many of the clusters ultimately separate around and are characterized by a particular artist. So these are clusters that kind of entirely comprise of prints by one artist, and there is a lot less overlap than what we might have expected. So for example, these are all clusters that contain only Modotti prints. So these papers have material characteristics that really only Modotti was choosing. Here we have a set of clusters that are entirely Weston. And then lastly, here we see kind of a group of clusters that are only Álvarez Bravo. So you can see that these particular prints are all kind of occupying their own distinct material spaces in terms of paper choice by kind of separating out into these clusters, and they're really separating out by artist. Now, we do have a few cases here where there are overlaps, and these particular cases are interesting to explore further for being able to better understand kind of the examples when these artists are deciding to choose kind of similar material papers. So we're gonna jump into that with a couple of these case studies.
So we initially flagged this cluster, cluster number 2, for its conservation concerns. So here we have 9 of Modotti's puppet prints grouped with a portrait of Tony Lujan by Álvarez Bravo, which is pictured in the top left of the screen. They're similar in that there are more matte papers, but the similarities extend beyond this, so we thought it deserved some extra attention and study. The Modotti prints are obviously severely discolored and faded, while the portrait by Álvarez Bravo, it might not be obvious here, but it exhibits extensive silver mirroring throughout the maximum density regions of the photograph. And each set of prints has their own unique conservation issues despite being clustered together. So I thought it would be interesting to go back and see if the Modotti prints exhibit any signs of silver mirroring developing on the surface, even if they're faint or not obvious yet, or whether the portrait by Álvarez Bravo has any areas of discoloration that is influencing their measurements that would end up with these prints all clustered together. And so in this way, print characterization has been useful in that it can also alert us to conservation concerns and inform our decision-making with regard to storage or exhibition recommendations for this particular set of prints. And we also highlighted these 2 clusters of Weston prints that were of particular interest. In cluster 12, pictured on the top of the slide, we see 6 portraits of Johann Hegemeyer grouped together, compared to cluster 13 at the bottom of the slide, which is comprised of just 2 prints, another portrait of Hegemeyer, and a photograph of a church. And here are the 2 prints from cluster 13, pictured here to scale for context. You can see that the 2 are very different in terms of both subject matter, a portrait of a close friend compared to a church visited by Weston during Holy Week, and presentation, a standalone print compared to one tipped into a journal page alongside other photographs. And furthermore, the portrait of Hegemeyer dates to 1925 when Weston had returned to Carmel, and the church print dates to 1924 while he was still living in Mexico. And it shows that Weston may have brought photographic papers from Mexico City back to Carmel or vice versa due to aesthetic preference or more economic use of materials. But what is most interesting is that this lone portrait of Hegemeyer in cluster 13 isn't clustered together with the other Hegemeyer portraits. The 2 photographs in cluster 13 are slightly warmer papers than those in cluster 12, but contextually, we can see that the Hegemeyer portraits are a connected series, all dating from the same time period, yet they're spread across different clusters. And why is this one Hegemeyer portrait singled out? So this reinforces the idea that these clusters are by no means absolute. Each cluster is still open to interpretation, and there can certainly be crossover between individual clusters of prints.
So this next case study is a cluster that contains a good number of both Modotti and Weston prints. In particular, as you can see, it comprises a variety of figure drawings, architectural details, building facades, landscapes, among other subject matter. Some of these prints may have been from when Modotti and Weston were exploring and preparing for some commissions in Mexico. Now I'm going to move to kind of the glyphs here to look at kind of the material characteristics that are shared by the prints in this cluster. And in particular, you can see that these are papers that are characterized by kind of a middling warmth and being very matte papers. Now, one of the things that we can do is that we can start to bring in the LML reference collection, so we can see the ways that, like which reference papers kind of contain similar material characteristics to the papers in this cluster. And so some of those papers that emerged included an earlier like Kodak Velox and Gavart Ridax that contain characteristics of also this kind of middling warmth and matte aspect. And these particular papers are known to have been kind of more common daily use papers, so they might have been used for kind of photographs that were taken more off the cuff around the house, taken in everyday life. And with that knowledge, when we go back to the prints in this cluster, we can kind of more clearly notice how, for example, some of these building facades and landscapes were taken when Modotti and Weston had kind of just arrived in Mexico. So this is, for example, a photograph of their first house and the hotel from their first night in Mexico City, the view from their patio. So these photographs are more for the purpose of like documentation and personal note-taking. So it makes sense they might have chosen kind of more of a daily common use type of paper. Now, this last case study is a cluster that contains an overlap of Weston and Álvarez Bravo. And I'm going to focus first on the glyphs. And here what you can see is that these glyphs, relative to a lot of the ones we've seen in the previous case studies, are very small. These glyphs you can see are kind of cooler, glossier, smoother, thinner papers. And then when you look at the images that correspond, you can see that in these prints. If we start just by looking at the Weston prints in this group, one of the things that we can start to notice is that relative to the prints that were measured from Weston's collection, a lot of the prints that are grouping together in this cluster include those that exhibit what we might colloquially consider his more kind of burgeoning modernist sensibility. This group contains some of his series of Tina reciting and a couple of his nudes, as well as some of these interesting composition shots. And so we can see the sort of modernist, move from pictorialist to modernist sensibility that he's sort of exploring in these early years in Mexico, kind of emerging here. And it's really interesting to be able to see that then paired with kind of these two Álvarez Bravo prints at the top. So you can see that Álvarez Bravo is choosing a paper that is, similar materially, but she's applying it in this different way, where she's taking photos of kind of the people and places in the local communities. So this is a case where we're seeing, these artists might have chosen something very similar in terms of material choices, but they're using them for these different applications.
So considering there are not many discernible overlaps between the expressive spaces and individual dimensions among these three artists, there are still trends and influences to be noted in the subject matter captured by each artist that is completely separate from the material aspects of their works. Just because they don't share a lot of material affinities does not mean the photographers weren't influenced by each other's work and aesthetics. In this comparison of Álvarez Bravo's Sexo Vegetal, Modotti's Flor de Manita, and Weston's Pepper, we see the repetitive use of sensual forms in these natural objects common to all three photographers. And beyond still lifes, there are additional similarities between Modotti and Álvarez Bravo in terms of subject matter and capturing the everyday lives of women in Mexico. Through this research project, we first and foremost wanted to track material similarities on the individual artist level and between artists, but we also wanted to formulate baselines for other collections. Because the CCP collects entire archives, not just individual prints, we can measure duplicates, find links between multiples, and study the entire career of a photographer, which may not be possible for other collections. This data on a granular level may seem oddly specific. We may ask ourselves why the thickness of a paper matters or color measurements matter, but each data point, no matter how small, is a springboard for the larger research questions that we and others may want to pursue. Why did artists include or exclude certain prints from their preferred sets of prints? Why did they make certain aesthetic decisions? And in our case, how did their relationships with other photographers affect or influence their practices over time? In the end, what is most surprising is the lack of overlap. On the one hand, it's gratifying to see a photographer like Álvarez Bravo occupying this completely separate space that is entirely her own, as she's often portrayed as an extension of other photographers. On the other hand, we wanted to see some strong correlation between the artists, especially Modotti and Weston, who are completely immersed in each other's worlds, living, working, and traveling together for a number of years. But maybe with additional analysis, this can prove to be the case because, again, what we've presented here really is just a snapshot of all that's available for study. Thank you all for your attention.